righty. Good.
Welcome to the Gay and Lesbian History on Stamps quarterly meeting. We will have a 45-minute presentation with an opportunity for questions afterwards. Our guest speaker is an award-winning science fiction writer, a military historian, and a member of the North Toronto Stamp Club, Royal Philatelic Society of Canada, and the Philatelic Specialist Society of Canada. He has a wide range of philatelic interests as a stamp collector, cachet maker, and exhibitor. His exhibits include Superman, which can still be seen online at the virtual stamp show, Doctor Who, A History in Stamps, and Flying Saucers Over Hollywood, the life of Edward D. Wood Jr. I am thrilled and honored to introduce Derwin Mak. Derwin?
All right, thanks, Lisa. And I'll share screen. And all right, so let's get up the PowerPoint presentation. All right, can everyone see that cover showing Edward D. Wood Jr.? All right.
Yes.
Good. All right. Cool. So Edward D. Wood Jr. He's a film director, notorious for being possibly the worst movie director who ever lived. May have made the worst movie he ever lived. So, can your heart stand the shocking facts about Edward D. Wood Jr.? Right. And just paraphrased one of the opening lines from his famous movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space. And as a person who's followed the career of Edward D. Wood Jr. since the 1970s, eventually I want to create an exhibit for a stamp show about Ed Wood Jr. But how do you create an exhibit about someone who will never be on a stamp? That is Edward D. Wood Jr., right? So, and also the other interesting thing about Ed Wood Jr., he's a straight guy who only ever slept with women or had relationships with women, but yet somehow in Toronto, he became an icon of the LGBTQ community. Well, at least a subset of them who like bad horror and sci-fi movies, and we'll find out why. Okay, so let's look at Ed Wood Jr.'s childhood, right? And Ed Wood was born in 1924 to his father, Ed Wood Sr., and mother Lillian Wood. There's a photograph of the parents, and Ed Sr. worked for the US Post Office. And he helped Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicate the Poughkeepsie Post Office building, which was a New Deal project, in 1937. Lillian was a buyer for a local department store. Now, of course, there's no stamps that ever show Ed Sr. or Lillian. So to represent their occupations and their backgrounds, I use these three stamps in my exhibit. Now, let's talk about Ed's childhood. You see his photograph of young 2-year-old Ed, riding on a horse, right? Well, he became fascinated with Western movies, such as Stagecoach. And he began to like movies at a young age. In his teen years, he got a job working as an usher in the movie theater. And in addition to Western movies, he was also fascinated with horror movies and horror stories and science fiction stories and movies. This is a set actually from a painting of stamps issued by the US in 1997, honoring the Universal Studios classic monsters from the 1930s and 40s. And down here is a strip of stamps from the US Space Fantasy booklet from 1993. And what I like about this booklet, the stamps in this booklet, is that the spaceships shown here have that retro 1930s Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers look to them. And that's the type of science fiction pulp magazine or comic strip or movie serial that Ed Wood would have watched in his childhood. Now, by all accounts, Ed Wood had a reasonably happy childhood. There's never been any reports of abuse or depression or anything unhappy. But there was one sort of out of the ordinary aspect about his childhood. His mother had wanted a girl but got a son instead. And Ed says that his mother would occasionally dress him up like a girl in girl's clothing. Right? And so in the exhibit, I included a first day cover of the Youth Month issue from 1949 because it showed two young Americans, and from time to time, Ed would be dressed as a boy, and from time to time, he'd be dressed as a girl. Right? Now, he didn't seem to mind being dressed up as a girl. The other thing, too, is that over time, he developed a fascination with Angora wool, right? Especially Angora sweaters. And this is Johnny Depp playing Ed Wood Jr. in the biographical movie Ed Wood, Tim Burton's 1994 movie. And in the Ed Wood movie, Ed Wood is played by Johnny Depp. When he gets stressed up, would rub himself up against an Angora sweater. Right? Now, what's interesting was when I exhibited my Ed Wood exhibit at Canpex, a Canadian national level show in London, Ontario, one of the judges said, "You should have included a stamp showing a sheep." And I said to him after all the judging was done and they handed out the awards, but Angora wool doesn't come from a sheep, it comes from a rabbit. That's why I had a stamp depicting a rabbit in it, right? So, which was this Canadian stamp for the year of the rabbit. Now, Ed, being very fascinated by horror and science fiction and westerns, basically B movies, was of course interested in making films of his own. So in 1936, on his 12th birthday, he received a movie camera as a gift. And one of his first film projects was to film the airship Hindenburg as it flew over the Hudson River at Poughkeepsie before it went to its disastrous explosion at Lakehurst, New Jersey in 1937. And these are German stamps showing the Hindenburg flying over to North America in 1936. All right. In 1941, the United States went to war, and Ed Wood, like many young men, enlisted in the US military. Here's a photograph of his grandmother, and there's Ed in his US Marine uniform, his mother, Lillian, and his father, who was head of his local VFW, or Veterans of Foreign Wars post or chapter during the war. Now, Ed, as a Marine, went to the Pacific and he fought at the Battle of Tarawa and was wounded there. So he earned a Purple Heart. So he did have a distinguished military career. But after the war, he claimed that he was more afraid of getting wounded than of getting killed because he claims to have gone into battle wearing women's underwear underneath his uniform, right? And he said that, you know, if he was killed, that'd be okay because he'd be dead and he wouldn't care about what the medics found underneath his uniform. But if he was wounded and he wound up in the hospital, everyone was going to notice that he showed up wearing women's underwear. And he also claimed that he had a stash of women's clothing that he took with them throughout the Pacific during the war. No one knows whether this is true or whether he was making it up, because a lot of people think it's highly unlikely that he could have cross-dressed while in the Marines in the Pacific during World War II. But nonetheless, that is the legend about Ed Wood. And interesting enough, one of the characters in one of his movies does go through World War II with a secret stash of women's clothing that he wears while on leave. Now, the postcard shows you know, a young lady walking down the street wearing 1940s clothes. I suspect that if Ed Wood really did dress in public in drag in the 1940s, this is the type of fashion he'd be emulating. Now, after World War II, Ed had to find a civilian career, and a new medium had reached the United States, and that was television, right? And it was a new medium, and there were jobs opening up in television, right? And so Ed went to Los Angeles, hoping to get work in this new entertainment medium. And this is a first day cover of one of the Celebrate the Century 1940s stamp showing the birth of television as the new entertainment medium. Okay. Here are some photographs from two of Ed Wood's early film and TV projects. He liked Westerns, so he started making a Western movie called Crossroads of Laredo. He never did finish it, but years later in the 2000s, some film historians discovered footage from the unfinished movie and added a soundtrack to it, no dialogue, just music, and released it onto YouTube. And here's another film he made, a short film called The Sun Was Setting. And it's about a woman who's terminally ill, and she wants to, before she dies, she wants to do, things that she's never gotten around to do, thrilling, exciting things like going to dinner in a fancy restaurant and visiting Chinatown. For some reason, she thinks visiting Chinatown is a really exciting adventure. What's interesting about this movie is that one of the secondary characters, not in this photograph, but one of the secondary characters was played by Noah O'Neill, later to find stardom playing Lois Lane in the Adventures of Superman TV series with George Reeves. Right. When he was in Hollywood, he made a lot of friends, and he surrounded himself with a group of friends whom one film historian called Day of the Locust Weirdos. Right now, some of you may remember the novel The Day of the Locust, or have seen the movie adaptation of it in the 1970s. It was about people who were at the fringes of the movie industry but could never really get a lot of success, and certainly were nowhere near star status in the movie industry. Well, that describes Ed Wood's friends. Right? They were all fringe players who wished they could be stars, wanted to be stars, but never got that opportunity, or really never had the talent to become big movie stars. Right? Now, I never thought that there'd be a first day cover maker or an event cover maker who actually wanted to commemorate Ed Wood and his Day of the Locust Weirdos, but there was one. Actually, I found another one later on too, and you'll see a cover from that guy. John Colasanti from Dora, Missouri, who operates under the name JVC Caches, made this cover to celebrate the 33rd anniversary of the death of Edward D. Wood Jr. It turns out Colasanti has the DVD set of Wood's movies. And this cachet shows Wood's group of friends in Hollywood. So let's see who they were. Well, number one is Valda Hansen, who starred in Night of the Ghouls and no other movie. And number two, wearing the weird turban, is Ken Duncan, who also starred in Night of the Ghouls, and I don't think he made any other movie either. Number three, this big, huge guy, was Tor Johnson, a Swedish-American wrestler, and he made 3 movies with Ed Wood, but didn't make any movies in the film business. And number 4, this fella, so Bela Lugosi, right? The famous actor who played Dracula was one of Wood's friends. Number 5 over here, Vampira, whose real name was Mela Nurmi, and we'll talk about her later on. Number 6, Joanna Lee. I think the only movie she ever made was Plan 9 from Outer Space. Number 7, John or Bunny Breckenridge, who played the lead alien in Plan 9 from Outer Space. I think he only made movies with Wood. And 8, Dudley Manlove, who played one of the alien invaders in Plan 9 from Outer Space. Again, he had a really short-lived movie career. So this was not, except for Vampira and Bela Lugosi, this was not exactly a group of people who had very extensive movie careers. Now, Mela Nurmi, also known as Vampira, was star of the Vampira show on KABC TV, a Los Angeles station, for 1 season. But that was all it took for her to become famous across the country. She was featured in Newsweek and in other magazines. And her job was to wear this costume, which she had made, and it's based on those Charles Addams cartoons, right? You might remember Charles Addams cartoons, And there was a TV show called The Addams Family based on his cartoons, right? And what she did was she would wear this costume and scream at the camera and introduce a horror movie that KABC TV was showing, right? And years, decades later, in the 1980s, another TV show presenter, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, Cassandra Peterson, would have a similar act. Now, in addition to playing Vampira, Mela Nurmi is also famous for being one of James Dean's girlfriends, right? And if you watch some documentaries about James Dean, some of the filmmakers interview her. This is another member of Ed Wood's entourage, Dolores Fuller, an actress who became Ed Wood's girlfriend. And so she starred in some of Ed Wood's movies, right? And Dolores Fuller is most famous for wearing an Angora sweater. Indeed, for some reason, for reasons that are somewhat obvious, Ed Wood insisted that she wear Angora sweaters in the movies where he put her, where he cast her. Right? Now this is Dolores Fuller in the crime drama Jailbait, directed by Ed Wood. Dolores Fuller did not have much success as a movie actress. The only person who could ever put her in movies was Ed Wood. So she left the movie industry and found much more success writing songs. She wrote 12 songs for Elvis Presley, starting with Rockahula Baby for his movie Blue Hawaii. And she also wrote songs for other stars, including writing the song Someone to Tell It To for Nat King Cole. Many of us are familiar with this 29-cent stamp depicting Elvis. Maybe we're not so familiar with this Malian stamp or a deluxe proof. Now, this is a stamp from Mali showing Nat King Cole, and it's a deluxe proof. Now, a deluxe proof is not a plate proof or a die proof. Plate proofs and die proofs are created as part of the production process towards making the finished stamp. So this was not printed, this proof was not printed to test a plate or a die. Deluxe proofs are printed at the end of the production process when the finished stamp is printed, and they're printed in the issued colors of the issued stamp. They're made as collector's items to sell to stamp collectors, and they're made by the French Postal Service, and they're also made by the former French colonies as well, right? Those African and Asian countries that have achieved independence, and Mali is one of them. Even though they're not part of the production process, as a die proof or a plate proof would be, they are collectible. Collectors of French and French community stamps do collect them. Now let's look at Bela Lugosi, who is Ed Wood's only star, right, or that entourage. Bela is depicted on this US stamp from 1997 from the classic Movie Monsters set. Bela Lugosi became famous playing Dracula in the Universal Studios horror movies, and he also played Igor as well in Son of Frankenstein, right? And he even had a turn playing the Frankenstein monster in one of the other sequels. That was in the 30s and the 40s, but by the 1950s, his career had stagnated. He wasn't getting any new roles, right? And he wasn't getting well-paid roles either. And he was reduced to dressing up as Dracula and going to movie theaters to promote other people's horror movies. Also, sometime in the 30s or 40s, he got injured and started taking painkillers. And unfortunately, by the 1950s, he became addicted to painkillers, and that was affecting his career too, right? So he was unfortunately a drug addict by the time Ed Wood met him. Bela Lugosi also shows up in this miniature sheet of stamps from Chad, and it depicts him playing Dracula from the 1930s movies. And Chad also issued a souvenir sheet showing Lagosi as Dracula. And this is a pictorial cancellation or postmark from Cluj-Napoca, a Romanian city, and it commemorates the 120th anniversary of the birth of Bela Lugosi in another Romanian town, Lugoj. And the date of the postmark is April 18th, 2002. Although Lugosi's birthday is actually October 20th in 1892. Now, you're probably wondering, why would a Romanian town have a commemorative postmark to honor Bela Lugosi, given that Bela Lugosi said he was born in Hungary and that he identified as Hungarian? Well, that's because those towns were part of Hungary when Bela Lugosi was born and grew up. But in 1920, Romania took over parts of Hungary, especially Transylvania, after the Romanian-Hungary War of 1918 and 1920. And so therefore, the towns of Cluj-Napoca and Lugoj had been in Hungary, but they spent the rest of the 20th century as part of Romania and are still part of Romania today. Now, in 1952, Christine Jorgensen became headline news in the United States, right? And Christine Jorgensen was America's first transgender celebrity. She probably wasn't the first American who was transgender, but she was definitely the first one who became a celebrity. And she had her sex change, or as we call it today, gender reassignment surgery, overseas. And when she came back to the United States, there were already reporters waiting for her at the airport. Some people suspect she may have leaked news about her surgery and transition to the press in advance because she was aiming to get a show business career, right? And so she became big headline news in the United States. This stamp commemorates the American woman, and it's from 1960. For some reason, in the 50s and 60s, the United States Post Office put up various stamps on various themes. They weren't necessarily tied to a specific anniversary event. This is one of them. I don't think it's tied to any particular theme, any particular event or anniversary, but I included it in the exhibit because to represent Christine Jorgensen, and we'll find out why Christine Jorgensen is important to Ed Wood's story. Now, Christine Jorgensen is not depicted on any stamp, right? And one of the questions I dealt with when I was creating my Ed Wood exhibit was, how do you make an exhibit about someone who will never be commemorated on a stamp? Now, I was actually thinking about Ed Wood. Christine Jorgensen may or may not show up in a stamp later on. Who knows what the future will tell, but I think it's a pretty good bet Ed Wood will never show up on a stamp. And the answer is to create the philatelic items yourself, right? So I created this cover to honor Christine Jorgensen on the 30th anniversary of her death in 1989, right? Now you'll see it has a mailer's postmark permit. I might be the only Canadian ever to get a mailer's postmark permit from a US post office. The Canadians in the audience might not know that in the United States, individuals can apply to their local postmaster and get a mailer's postmark permit. And if successful, the applicant can then get his own canceling device and cancel his or her own mail, right? Now, the original intent of the mailer's postmark permit was so that people who had a lot of mail, like for example, companies that sent out a lot of catalogs to their mail order clients, could cancel their mail in advance and thereby save the postal clerks some labor, and that would help get the catalogs or other mail out to the recipients faster. But it didn't take very long for stamp collectors to realize this was a way they could make their own canceling devices. And so a lot of stamp collectors in the United States have gotten mailer's postmark permits. And also, you don't actually have to live in a particular town to get that town's mailer's postmark permit. The big challenge is usually that many postmasters and their staff don't know what a mailer's postmark permit is, because that's one of the more obscure parts of the postal manual. I go to Los Angeles at least once a year for a science fiction convention. And I thought, yeah, just as a lark, I'll apply for a Miller's postmark permit from a downtown post office, zip code 90052. Much to my surprise, I got permission for the permit, so I got the canceling device made. Right? So that's one way to get an item to depict someone who won't be depicted on a stamp and include it in your exhibit. No, it does not win you gold medals at shows, but who cares about the medal if you're having fun? So Christine Jorgensen became big news in the United States, TV shows, reporters, everyone wanted to interview her. And B-movie producer George Weiss wanted to make a movie about Christine Jorgensen, but she declined to appear in it. Probably a good call because George Weiss had a reputation for making really cheap exploitation movies on sensationalized themes. So Weiss hired Ed Wood to make an exploitation movie about a character based on Christine Jorgensen, but for obvious legal reasons, not with the name Christine Jorgensen. So Wood said he would make a movie called I Changed My Sex. But he delivered a somewhat different movie, which didn't really match Weiss's expectations. Instead, he delivered a movie called Glenn or Glenda in 1953. And it wasn't about a person, well, it's actually got two stories. The main story, which takes up 3/4 of the movie, is actually about a guy named Glenn who cross-dresses as and uses the pseudonym Glenda, well cross-dressed as a woman. And coincidence of coincidences, Glenda likes to wear Angora sweaters, right? Just like Ed Wood did, right? So 3/4 of the movie is dominated by Glenn, who cross-dresses as Glenda, right? And then right at the end of the movie, in the last quarter, there's this tacked on B story or second story about someone who does undergo the transition surgery and lives full-time as a woman. And we'll talk about that. So this is the movie Glenn or Glenda, which some people consider to be one of the worst movies of all time. It's really low budget. The production values are low. The dialogue is atrocious. I mean, it's so corny, right? And but it does have some interesting aspects to it. It's possibly the first movie that's sympathetic to cross-dressers and transgender women. Ed Wood doesn't treat them as being freaks or deviants or villains or people who can do evil. He treats us rather sympathetically, and all throughout the movie, several of the characters and the two narrators, yes, it has two narrators, ask the audience to treat these individuals with respect and understanding and tolerance. Now, this was quite radical for 1953. The 50s were not, the general public of the 50s, most of them didn't think this way. And over here on the left is a scene from the Glenn story, Glenn or Glenda story. It shows Glenn's fiance, Barbara, played by Dolores Fuller, giving her Angora sweater to Glenn, who's played by Ed Wood. So this movie is somewhat autobiographical as well. And and Angora sweaters figure a lot in Ed Wood movies, right? Now, I mentioned that there was a second plot in the last quarter of the movie. And that second plot is about a person named Alan, played by Tommy Haynes. Now, in the credits, Tommy has quotation marks around the name Tommy. I can't find much about Tommy Haynes. The other members of Ed Wood's entourage, as limited as their movie careers were, did leave historical evidence about what they were doing. And in later years, they showed up at sci-fi and comic book conventions, trading off on their popularity as Ed Wood's stars. The Tommy Haynes seems to have just disappeared. I can't find any information about this person. Maybe I will in the future. But in this story, Alan is a US military vet who fights in World War II, and he or she has a stash of women's clothing. And when Alan is on leave between combat assignments, switches into women's clothing and secretly goes about town dressed as a woman. Now, this sounds very much like what Ed Wood said he was doing during the war. So again, it's slightly autobiographical. The difference, though, is that Alan goes overseas and gets the surgery and transitions and starts living full-time as a woman named Anne. Right? So that's the second story in Glen or Glenda. So as you can see, this is quite an enlightened movie for its times. But there is some aspects of it that modern audiences, or at least liberal audiences of today, might find a little retrograde, and that's that it does treat both cross-dressers and transgender women as subsets of transvestites, and I'm using the 1950s terminology from the movie. It treats them as subsets of transvestites who are differentiated by their need for different psychological and physical treatments. In the movie, Glenn, the doctor determines that Glenn doesn't really need surgery, but the doctor also determines that, yes, Alan should get the surgery and transition to live full-time as Anne. Right. Now, all throughout this movie, Bela Lugosi shows up as this omniscient, godlike narrator who stares down at the characters and mutters weird poems from time to time, right? And one of the poems is the famous Big Green Dragon poem, right? And at random times in the movie, he'll show up and say, "Beware the big green dragon that sits at your doorstep. He eats little boys, puppy dogs' tails, and big fat snails. Beware, take care, beware." Okay, I know I don't do the Dracula accent as well as Lagosi did, but you get the idea. And so I found stamps to represent the dragon, little boys, puppy dogs' tails, and even a snail, right, from the Slow Food Italia issue, right? For some reason, Italy issued a stamp to commemorate what they call the slow food movement, which is the opposite of eating fast food. And for some reason in Italy, the slow food movement has an English name. Various movie fans have debated the meaning of the Big Green Dragon poem. I suspect it might be some early inkling that overemphasis of masculinity might lead to what we would call toxic masculinity today, but who knows what was going through Ed Wood's mind when he made Glen or Glenda. Now, there's also a gay pickup scene in Glen or Glenda, right? Now, this scene is missing in some prints of Glen and Glenda, and it's in other scenes. And in this scene, this fella who's always either offering cigarettes to people or excuse me for a sec. One of those telemarketer types, I can tell by the area code, right? This fella who's always offering cigarettes to individuals in the street is gay and trying to pick up other gay men on the street. And he accosts Glenn, who's dressed as Glenda, who declines the offer, right? And in the movie, the narrator mentions that cross-dressers are not gay, right? And this is 1953, and that's contrary to the public perception at the time that all men who cross-dress must automatically be gay. And to some extent, that perception still exists in society today. But as we know, cross-dressers could be gay, or they could be straight, or they could be anywhere on that spectrum, right? Gender presentation doesn't necessarily match, sexual orientation. Right? However, the narrator also mentions that some gay men dress like women to attract other men, presumably straight men, right? And that, unfortunately, is a stereotype of the time. And that stereotype still persists a bit today, but it's definitely a stereotype right? Which, and in that way, Ed Wood was reflecting some of the biases of the time. Now, there's a few, the modern audiences might find some paradoxes and problematic parts of Glenn or Glenda. The film does say that there's nothing wrong with cross-dressing, which is referred to as transvestitism in the movie. Remember, we're using 1950s terminology, and cross-dressing hasn't entered the vocabulary yet. We'd have to wait till the 1970s, I think, for that. Glenn seeks to be cured of his so-called illness by a psychiatrist. He gets cured by psychiatric treatment and by marrying Barbara, right? There's also this weird end of the film revelation that Anne was what the doctor calls a pseudo-hermaphrodite with both male and female organs. And that strongly implies or hints that gender identity is based solely on anatomy. And as we know today, our more advanced or enlightened understanding is that your anatomy isn't the only thing that determines your gender identity. And in fact, for some people, it isn't a factor at all. Your gender identity is what's in your mind and your feeling. It's not based on your anatomy, right? Also, in this movie, there's suddenly these random scenes of strippers taking off their clothes and dancing, and this random scene of a woman getting attacked on a couch by a guy who's, you know, it's a violent sexual assault. These were not put there by Ed Wood. George Weiss inserted these striptease and stag film scenes into the movie after Ed Wood delivered the movie to him, because George Weiss thought that these scenes would make the movie more marketable to some audiences. Right? Now, some of these scenes are missing in some prints of the film, but they're in other prints of the film as well, right? And there's an African jungle scene showing Africans dancing in the jungle, and one of them is wearing this big, you know, fake African tribal mask. It goes to stereotypes of Africans at the time. However, nonetheless, despite all these problematic scenes and paradoxes, Glenn or Glenda is definitely one of the first movies, if not the first movie, that's sympathetic to cross-dressers and transgender people and asks society to treat them as, you know, just regular people, which was not the prevailing opinion at the time. Here's another example of do-it-yourself fidelity. Being an Ed Wood fan, I couldn't miss the opportunity to create a cover for the 65th anniversary of Glenn or Glenda, so I made this cover. Well, after making Glenn or Glenda, he made a crime movie called Jailbait. Now, the word jailbait must have had a different meaning back then. Today, we associate it with an underage girl who can get a guy charged for statutory rape, right? But in the movie, jailbait really refers to criminals who can get other criminals, implicate other criminals in crimes and get them charged and imprisoned too, right? And this movie was about a gangland war playing out in Los Angeles, and quite impressively, Ed Wood got the assistance of the Hollywood branch of the Los Angeles Police Department to assist him in the filming of it. So in my exhibit, I want to include a cover or object to represent the Los Angeles Police Department. And I found this cover being sold on eBay. So I bought it to get the LAPD 140th anniversary cancel. And not only does it celebrate the 140th anniversary of the LAPD, but it's also for the first day of sale of the Dragnet stamp, which was part of that pane of stamps to commemorate early TV memories from 2009, right? You might remember that pane of stamps. It's got Dragnet and the Twilight Zone and the Milton Berle Show and Lucy on it, right? Now, when I received the cover, I noticed something really odd about it. The postage is really paid by the definitive stamp with the U.S. flag on it, but the Dragnet stamp wasn't really a stamp. It's actually a photograph of the stamp that was printed onto the envelope. And look closely, it's actually got that diagonal line through the denomination, which is what the Postal Service wants people to do when they reproduce pictures of stamps in news media, right? And I thought, well, this is really weird. This cancel is being used on the stamp it wasn't intended to cancel. And instead of having the stamp it was intended to cancel, the cover has a photograph of it. What a weird oddity. The cover is made by Thomas Peluso from West Hampstead, New York, who operates under the name of Therome Cachets. One of these days, I'm gonna have to contact Thomas Peluso and get an answer. Just what is the story behind this cover? Why did you use a photograph instead of the real stamp? However, for an exhibit about the weird and eccentric Edward D. Wood Jr., a cover like this would actually fit in. Now, his next movie was Bride of the Monster, right? Which was his first science fiction movie, right? And this is a complete B-grade cheap movie with a really wretched plot, terrible dialogue, all the hallmarks of Ed Wood movies. And in this movie, Dr. Vornoff, played by Bela Lugosi, thinks he can create a race of superhumans by bombarding their brains with atomic radiation, right? Now, he does think that this is a peaceful objective, but his methods include abducting people and killing them in his failed experiments, so his methods are far from humane. And this is not exactly the use of nuclear science imagined or promoted by this 1955 stamp promoting atoms for peace, which I put in the exhibit. Now, in the center of the scene is Tor Johnson, the Swedish American wrestler, as Lobo. And Dr. Vornoff mentions that he recruited Lobo, his henchman, in the wilderness of Tibet. Yep, Tor Johnson really does do a convincing acting job playing a Tibetan villager. Well, after Bride of the Monster, Ed Wood made his magnum opus, his most famous movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space. Now, I never thought anyone would make a cover to commemorate what's been now known as the worst movie ever made or the worst science fiction movie ever made, but someone did, and that was Danny Lee from Corsicana, Texas. And he made this cover to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the premiere of Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's canceled in his hometown of Corsicana, Texas, instead of Los Angeles, but nothing wrong with that, right? And of course, I couldn't resist my own Plan 9 from Outer Space anniversary cover, right? And this scene the cachet depicts a scene from Plan 9 from Outer Space, showing Tor Johnson as the murdered police inspector Daniel Clay, resurrected from the dead, and Vampira, Mila Nurmi, as another resurrected corpse, billed as Vampire Girl in the movie's credits. Now, what is the plot of Plan 9 from Outer Space? Well, as one of the lines of dialogue says, yes, Plan 9 deals with the resurrection of the dead. Long-distance electrodes shot into the pineal and pituitary glands of the recent dead. So aliens come from space and they bombard nuclear radiation into a graveyard and thereby resurrect recently deceased people as zombies, which they will use to invade and take over the earth. Now, throughout this whole movie, they only succeed in resurrecting 3 people. And with an army of 3 people, they're going to, take over the whole planet, right? Here are 2 of the 3 people. Here's the third one, Bela Lugosi, who was buried, in real life, Bela Lugosi was buried in his Dracula cape. And in Plan 9 from Outer Space, he's also buried in the Dracula cape before he gets resurrected from the dead. Now what's interesting is that this is Bela Lugosi's last movie, but it wasn't the movie he intended to make. Originally, he was making a movie called The Vampire's Tomb with Ed Wood, but then Lagosi died. And then after his death, Ed Wood used the footage from the unfinished Vampires 2 and put it into Plan 9 from Outer Space, right? And in Plan 9 from Outer Space, those scenes of Lagosi, wandering through the graveyard dressed as Dracula are used as footage of one of the resurrected dead people, come to help the aliens to conquer the Earth. Now, Plan 9 from Outer Space is also famous for its scenes showing flying saucers flying over Hollywood, right? So, of course, I made a cover with this cachet showing the 3 flying saucers flying over Hollywood, right? That the massive invasion fleet consists of only 3 flying saucers and 1 big mothership in orbit, right? Now, there's an urban legend that the flying saucers were made out of either paper plates or tinfoil pie plates that were hung up on strings or wires. That's not true. The strings and wires part is true, but they weren't paper plates or tinfoil plates. They were a plastic model kit made by the company called Lindbergh in 1952. Right, and it holds the distinction of being the first plastic model kit with a science fiction or space theme, the Lindbergh flying saucer model. And in the 1970s, the Lindbergh flying saucer was reissued with glow-in-the-dark green plastic, and teenage me, after having watched Plan 9 from Outer Space on late-night television, had to go to my local hobby store and buy the Lindbergh flying saucer and assemble it. So many years later, as an adult, I took a photograph of the Lindbergh flying saucer model and used Photoshop to put it in front of a backdrop or photograph of space from the NASA website. And I used that image to get a personalized stamp made by Canada Post. In Canada, you can buy personalized stamps and get your own image on it. So people put photos of themselves or their family or their dogs on it, or pictures from their wedding or their engagement pictures on it, and get personalized stamps made. So I was able to get a personalized stamp showing my photograph of the Lindbergh flying saucer, and I made first day covers for my own personalized stamp at Toronto's first post office, which is where the castle comes from. I also know a comic book artist named Ron Sutton, who's most famous for drawing the Elvira, Mistress of the Dark comics from the 1980s. These are comics based on the Elvira, Mistress of the Dark TV shows, right? And the Ron Sutton lives in Canada too, so we would always bump into each other at comic book conventions and sci-fi conventions. So I got to draw hand-drawn cachets of some covers that I made. So this is Jorgensen as Inspector Daniel Clay from Plan 9 from Outer Space, and Vampira as Vampire Girl in Plan 9 from Outer Space. Now, let's talk about the amazing Criswell. Yes, there is Criswell. And Criswell became famous, at least locally, in Los Angeles in the 1950s for hosting a psychic prediction show. And he claimed to have psychic powers. He claimed to be able to predict the future. Practically almost none of his predictions ever came true, but that did not stop people from tuning in and watching the amazing Criswell. And on December 31st, 1965, he went on the Today Show with Johnny Carson. Remember him? And he predicted the events for the upcoming year, 1966. Well, in the 1960s, Criswell predicted that the end of the world would come on August 18th, 1989, and a big cloud would come from outer space and completely cover the world and choke all life out of the world, right? So, all animal and plant life would completely die on August 18th, 1999. So to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the end of the world, at least according to Criswell, I made this commemorative cover 20 years after the world ended. And there's the amazing Criswell, who always wore a tuxedo when making his predictions. And he wears a tuxedo in Plan 9 from Outer Space because he's the narrator of Plan 9 from Outer Space. Ed Wood made another movie after Plan 9 from Outer Space, and that was Night of the Ghouls. Not as interesting as Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's a little bit more boring. It's about this fellow wearing the turban who pretends he's actually a fake psychic, pretending to be a real one. But unfortunately for him and the other characters, real ghouls show up at the house. Right? And there's Criswell again wearing a tuxedo in Night of the Ghouls. Well, Night of the Ghouls was made in the 1950s, but it was not released until 1984. That's because Ed Wood ran out of money and could not pay the lab that was printing the prints of the movie, right? And so it stayed with the lab until 1984, when film historian, B-movie fan, and film restorer Wade Williams paid for the long overdue lab fee and released Night of the Ghouls to VHS cassette, right? And this is a set of Canadian stamps showing various ghouls. There's a vampire, there's a werewolf, a goblin, and a ghost. Now, Night of the Ghouls was the last movie that Ed Wood made that could, by some stretch of the imagination, be called a mainstream movie. I mean, it did Plan 9 from Outer Space, Bride of the Monster, Glen or Glenda did not play in a lot of theaters, and they typically played in low-budget B-movie theaters, but at least the general public could see them. In the 1960s, his career shifted, and he worked in porno movies and softcore porno movies, and he's got to writing porno novels as well. Now, sometimes he was the writer, sometimes he was the director, sometimes he wrote for other directors, sometimes he directed movies based on other people's screenplays. Occasionally, he'd show up as an actor, and this is Wood in drag as the cross-dresser Alicia in Take It Out and Trade, a softcore porn feature that he wrote and directed in 1970, and it was lost for decades but rediscovered in 2017. Right, so that was quite a career shift, right? Unfortunately, a career shift like that doesn't make you part of the Hollywood mainstream, which he desperately wanted to get into. And his later years, his last decade, were not very happy ones. After breaking up with Dolores Fuller, he got married, and then he divorced his first wife, and then he met his second wife, Kathy, and married her. But by the 1970s, he was living in poverty, and both he and Kathy were alcoholics by the late 70s. He was working in porn and writing porno movies and writing porno novels, but although the work was steady, it wasn't that well paying as either. Right? He certainly wasn't making Steven Spielberg's income. And in 1978, he died of a heart attack. I made this cover, a memorial cover to honor him on the 40th anniversary of his death. And I used the Purple Heart stamp because Ed Wood was a Marine who got wounded in World War II and earned a Purple Heart. This is a stamp I use in the exhibit as well. In 1981, the US issued a stamp with the alcoholism, you can beat it theme, right? Now, Ed Wood died in 1978, and he died in obscurity, although he was known to people who watched B movies and fans of B movies. And in 1979, Harry and Michael Medved, the Medved brothers, published a book called the 51st Movies of All Time. And this book became a bestseller. So 50 movies that were just awful. And some people wrote to the Medveds and said, oh, you forgot one movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space. You have to take a look at the movie. Well, the Medveds had heard about it, which was a surprise, but they did watch it. And a year later, they came out with a follow-up book called the Golden Turkey Awards. And in that book, they declared Ed Wood Jr. to be the worst director of all time, and they gave him the Golden Turkey Award. Right? And I remember a news article from that time saying there was even a ceremony to hand out the Golden Turkey Awards, and an ex-Playboy playmate came to accept the little statuette on behalf of the late Ed Wood, and she said, "I have no idea how I'm going to get this to him." Right? It was a strange affair. And I wanted to include a stamp depicting a turkey in my exhibit. And lo and behold, the US actually issued a stamp showing a big inflatable turkey balloon. I guess that must be the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, being led by a cowboy. And this stamp was issued in 2009. I said, I couldn't resist buying a stamp with such a theme, inflatable turkey balloons on Thanksgiving parade. So I included this stamp, this first day cover in my exhibit. Now, after the Medved brothers book, the Golden Turkey Awards came out, Ed Wood became popular with B-movie fans, right? He became known as the worst film director ever made, and his movies got the reputation of being so awful they were actually funny and enjoyable to watch. And in 1982, there was a documentary that put together clips from various bad movies. This documentary is called It Came from Hollywood, and John Candy narrated it. John Candy is the Canadian comedian whom you may have seen in various movies and TV shows, right? This is a 2006 Canadian stamp honoring John Candy. And It Came from Hollywood, after introducing clips from Ed Wood's movies, John Candy shows up wearing a dress, right? And he gets picked up by Dan Aykroyd in the motorcycle, and Dan Aykroyd's wearing a bra. So they're making fun of Ed Wood's habits of cross-dressing. But that was the 80s. And then in the 90s, Ed Wood acquired other fans, and they began to reevaluate his legacy to filmmaking. Some of them thought Ed Wood, you know what, he may have made bad movies, but there's a certain charm to his movies. And I remember one film historian saying, faced with his low budget and lack of acting talent in his cast, most other movie directors would have just given up, but Ed Wood forged on and made a movie anyway. And Jim Nipfel, writing for Den of Geek, a website devoted to science fiction and horror movies, wrote that his films have a unique energy and charm that should be appreciated. So in the 1990s, science fiction fans and B-movie fans began to reevaluate Ed Wood, and they began to call him the best of the worst, or the auteur of B-movies, and some people even said he was like the Jean-Luc Godard of bad movies, right? One of the earliest film magazines to reassess Ed Wood's legacy was Cinefantastique, an American publication devoted to science fiction and horror movies. And this is the cover that enclosed a letter that I received from Cinefantastique in the early 1980s. I think it enclosed a rejection letter from Cinefantastique saying it didn't want to buy an article from me, right? But I kept it anyway. It had a slogan cancel. And so I saved it all these years, and it wound up in my exhibit. Also in the 1990s, Tim Burton, the director of movies like Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands, made a biographical movie about Ed Wood called Ed Wood, starring Johnny Depp as Ed Wood Jr. Right? And it was a very sympathetic movie. It portrayed Ed Wood as being a sort of gifted, eccentric genius who was not really understood by the Hollywood movie community, right? It did well. It got several Academy Award nominations. Now, Ed Wood Jr., Bela Lugosi, and their friends, none of them got an Academy Award. None of them got an Academy Award nomination, but Martin Landau did get an Academy Award or an Oscar for playing Bela Lugosi in Tim Burton's Ed Wood. He got the award for Best Supporting Actor in 1995. And this cover has a pictorial postmark or cancel showing the Academy Award statuette, the Oscar itself, and it's for the 50th anniversary of the Academy Awards. Postmark city is Los Angeles, of course. Now, what's interesting about this cover is that the cachet or envelope is a business envelope from Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, a place that has nothing to do with movies or filmmaking, but I liked it anyway because I wanted the cancel, and I used to go to Caesar's Palace almost every 2 years because I like playing the slot machines over there. And there I am meeting Martin Landau at Fan Expo Canada, Canada's largest comic book convention. Great actor. It's unfortunate he passed away several years ago. Now, you know you're a Hollywood legend when people cosplay as your characters. What's cosplaying? Cosplaying, which in the old days was known as costuming, is the hobby of dressing up as a character from a science fiction or comic book or anime series, right, or movie. And you dress up these characters, and people dress up with them at comic book conventions and sci-fi conventions. And the cosplayer AV and Terry's posted this photograph on the internet of cosplayers dressed up as characters from Plan 9 from outer space, right? So I created this Canadian picture postage stamp or personalized postage stamp showing a cosplayer dressed as Ed Wood, dressed as Glenda from Glen or Glenda, right? Holding one of those movie slates, you know, you slam them down, say action, and then the filming starts, right? And the cachet I designed and printed shows Ed Wood dressed as Glenda in Glen or Glenda. There's that Angora sweater again. Now in Canada, you can get your personalized stamps in a variety of configurations. You can get them as booklets, you can get them in sheets or panes of 50, or you can get them in sheets or panes of 25. And if you get them in a pane of 25, you get a 26 stamp, the so-called bonus stamp, right? And in the pane of 25, you can also get what they call a souvenir enlargement. The big salvage area gives you an opportunity to have your photograph there, right, to take as what they call a souvenir enlargement. Now, most people use the same photograph that they put in the stamp in the souvenir enlargement, but I used a different photograph of the cosplayer. And this is the original photograph of the cosplayer, and this is the stamp that was produced. And in case you haven't figured out, now that's me. That cosplayer is me, dressed as Ed Wood, dressed as Glenda. And what's interesting is that I sent off a couple friends of mine to enter my exhibit about Ed Wood at Canpex, the Canadian National Exhibition in London, Ontario. It's a national level exhibition. And I didn't tell anyone that that was me in the stamp and the cover. And the exhibition actually had the single stamp, the cover, and the pane of 25 with the souvenir enlargement in it. No one asked me whether that was really me in it. So I don't know if anyone ever noticed that was me, but that's me. Now, I wore this costume at a sci-fi convention in Grand Island, New York, right? And a debate broke out. If I'm dressed as a male character who's dressed as a woman, is that still drag? Because I am dressed as a male character, Ed Wood. And someone said, well, my daughter did that once. She dressed as a woman who dresses as a guy, and she came up with the term double drag. So I'm in double drag, apparently. So that's me in the personalized stamp. Well, Ed Wood has become popular with B-movie fans. And in Toronto, we have a series of B-movie screenings called the Dumpster Raccoon Film Series, held at some movie theater called the Review Cinema. And it shows, B-movies and grindhouse movies. right? And one of the screenings in March of 2019 was a double feature, an Ed Wood double feature of Glenda and Plan 9 from Outer Space. And it was also used as a benefit screening for Rainbow Railroad, which is a nonprofit organization that helps LGBTQ plus people leave countries where their lives are endangered, right? They could be, it could be against the law there to be gay, or people get executed for being gay or transgender in those countries, right? So Rainbow Railroad helps them escape from those countries. The guy in the shiny gold jacket is Anthony Oliveira, a Toronto-based comic book artist and host of the Dumpster Raccoon film series. And here's Ed Wood, again, at the screening. So Ed Wood Jr., B-movie director, so-called worst movie director of all time, did achieve a sort of fame as a Hollywood legend. Decades after his death, there's the actual Ed Wood Jr. playing Glenda. There's Johnny Depp playing Ed Wood, dressed as Glenda. And well, there's me in costume. I know the costume's not completely screen accurate. The skirt's way too short, but no one complained at Comic-Con. So Ed Wood in his movies always made sure that the audience knew that it was filmed in Hollywood, USA. It never said Los Angeles or Burbank or anything like that. He always insisted that his movies said that they were filmed in Hollywood, USA, and in the credits at the end. So, Ed was very much a person who had aspirations to become part of the Hollywood film scene. And although in life he never made it as a Hollywood legend, he did achieve that status posthumously. So thank you for listening to my presentation about Ed Wood Jr. And I'm free to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Derwin. That was quite interesting, in great depth. We enjoyed it immensely. We have a couple questions that came in the chat box.
All right. Okay, and I have to figure out how to get back to
can you tell us the steps that you went through to get the post mail cancel?
The post mail. Okay, are we talking about the Canadian cancellations? Or I could talk about both of them.
And in America as well.
Well, the Canadian cancels. I got those Canadian cancels done at Toronto's first post office, which was a post office that dates back to the 1830s, and it functions as both a post office and a museum. Now, in Canada, we don't have the hand back cancel policy, right? I know in the United States, it's part of the operating manual that philatelists can ask for a cancel and get the cover handed back to them, but unfortunately, sometimes the postal clerks don't realize that's allowed, so they just keep the cover and throw it in the mail stream. In Canada, there is no hand back cancel policy, so almost all postal clerks would just keep the cover and throw it into the mail stream. But Toronto's first post office, because the staff there are also working for a museum, they do allow their customers to get hand back service. So I got my first day covers canceled there because they allow hand back service. They stopped doing that during the pandemic because they don't want everyone touching the canceling device. They used to let the stamp collectors actually operate the canceling device as well, right? But they stopped that. The American cancels, right? So after I got the mailer's postmark permit, I had to go find a rubber stamp company that could make the stamp to the USPS specifications. And there are specifications on how big the cancel should be, and it should have the wavy lines, and it should have the postmark permit on it. I finally did find one in Alberta somewhere, and I ordered it from them, and I've used it to cancel the mail. Now, a lot of philatelists or stamp collectors who have a mailer's postmark permit, they typically use them for philatelic mail, so a lot of their mail doesn't actually want it in the mail stream. But if you do want to put it in the mail stream, you just can't put the covers that you've canceled into just any ordinary mailbox. You actually have to take it to the post office that issued the permit to you and give it to one of the staff there, right? So that's how the mailer's postmark permit works. Okay.
Another question they had was, how do we find these Ed Wood movies to watch?
Okay, well, some of them are actually on YouTube. Glenda is on YouTube, and depending on which one got posted, you'll see either the complete film or the film with some of the scenes missing on it. Plan 9 from Outer Space, someone's actually posted the whole movie there. And Jailbait is also on YouTube too. And his early TV short, The Sun Was Rising, is also on YouTube. Also, if you search on eBay, you can actually get a box set of all the Ed Wood so-called mainstream movies, not as porno movies, but Glenda, Jailbait, Plan 9 from Outer Space, and Night of the Ghouls and Bride of the Monster, and a documentary about Ed Wood. There's actually a box set that you can buy from secondary markets now.
Thank you very much. That is all we have in the chat box. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to have a question specifically? They're all on mute. I muted them. No?
Nope.
Not at this time. So I will stop the recording. Thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it immensely. Please stay there.